Hi, this is Back in On. In today's episode, we are going to discuss about inter-service communication in microservices. If you have come across the terms like synchronous communication, asynchronous communication, REST APIs, gRPCs, and message queues, and have no idea where these terms fit into a larger picture, you have come to the right video. Let's get started. So we have two microservices. One is transaction service and another is fraud detection service. Transaction service performs the transaction for a given user. So let's say the user zone request for the transaction. The transaction service needs to verify whether zone is fraud or not. For that, it will call the fraud detection service. One question: can transaction service proceeds further without getting the response from the fraud detection service? No. Transaction service needs to wait for the response from the fraud detection service. It needs to confirm whether zone is fraud or not before performing the transaction for zone. So this is known as the synchronous communication. So in synchronous communication, the calling service, transaction service in our case, waits for the response from the target microservice, fraud detection service in our case. So one important characteristics of synchronous communication is that both of these services should be up at the same time. So it is like two persons talking to each other. So if any one of them is not listening, the information is lost. For example, if the fraud detection service is down, then transaction service will send the request to the fraud detection service. But since the fraud detection service is down, transaction service keeps on waiting and waiting until the request times out. So even one service is down, they cannot perform their task together. Another point is that the transaction service or the client service task is blocked until the response arrives from the target microservice. Here in this example, the transaction service cannot proceed further until the response of fraud detection service arrives. One thing is important to note here is that the task is blocked. The task of performing the transaction for zone is blocked, but the underlying thread making the request to the fraud detection service may or may not block depending upon the implementation of transaction service. Now let's look at the another example. We have transaction service as previous and email notification service. When the transaction occurs successfully, we will send an email to the user. Yes, we get the request for the transaction for the user zone. The transaction service will call the email notification service to send email to the zone. In this example, unlike in the previous, the transaction service does not need to wait for the response of email notification service. The transaction service doesn't wait for the response and it carries its own normal execution. At a later point in time, when email notification service successfully sends an email, it will send a response to the transaction service. This is known as the asynchronous communication. The calling microservice does not need to wait for the response of the target microservice. It is like two persons talking to each other, but not face to face, but by writing down in a piece of paper. Transaction service has a message to send to email notification service. It writes that message down in a paper, queue in our case. And the email notification service will pick up or read that message from the paper or the queue in our case. So this decouples the transaction service and email notification service. So both the service does not need to be up at the same time. So let's say email notification service is down. What will happen? The transaction service will write its message to the queue, and whenever the email notification service will be up, it will take that message from the queue. The message is not lost, unlike in the synchronous communication. The client service task is not blocked until the response. The transaction service does not have to wait for the response of the email notification service. So it will simply put the message in the queue, and it will carry its own normal execution. And whenever the email notification service is ready, it will take that message from the queue, perform the transaction, and send the response to the transaction service. This way, the client service task is not blocked, unlike in the synchronous communication. So this is it. In this way, synchronous communication needs the calling microservice to wait for the target microservice response, and asynchronous communication does not require the client microservice to wait for the response of the target microservice. The example of synchronous communication involves REST APIs and gRPCs, where asynchronous communication examples involves message queues. Thank you. If you like the video, and if you are into backend engineering, consider subscribing this channel. We will be having more this kind of videos in the future. We'll see you in the next video.